On the night of December 5th, 2022, something happened inside Russia that was not supposed to be possible. Two air bases, Engels and Dyagilevo, hundreds of miles from Ukraine's borders, deep inside Russian territory, lit up simultaneously. Explosions, fires, damage to aircraft and infrastructure that Russia had considered completely beyond the reach of any Ukrainian weapon. These were not border facilities. These were strategic bomber bases. Home to Tupolev Tu-95S, Soviet-era nuclear-capable aircraft that Russia had been using to rain cruise missiles down on Ukrainian cities. Untouchable, by every calculation Moscow had made, until they weren't. 3 weeks later, on December 26th, Engels burned again. Same base, same message. Not a fluke, not a one-off. A signal delivered twice to ensure nobody missed it. Russia had invaded Ukraine, expecting a country that would crumble in days. What it got was something different, something it had not modeled, had not planned for, and had no adequate answer to. And what happened in the years that followed those first strikes is the most consequential military transformation of the 21st century, not because of the weapons involved, but because of what those weapons revealed about the gap between Russia's self-image and Russia's actual vulnerability. Stay with me, because what unfolded between December 2022 and March 2026 is not a story about drones. It is the story of how a country that was written off by every military analyst on the planet systematically dismantled the myth of Russian invulnerability one strike at a time, one refinery at a time, one airfield at a time, until the country that launched a war of conquest found itself the one living inside an active war zone. And the man who built that myth, Vladimir Putin, only has himself to blame for what has replaced it. To understand how Russia became a war zone, you first need to understand what Russia believed it was in February 2022. Not since the Soviet Union's collapse had the Russian military projected such confidence in its own capability. The numbers justified it. Close to 1 million active-duty personnel, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of armored vehicles, Soviet-era stockpiles that had been accumulating for decades, an air force built around strategic bombers and advanced fighters, a navy that controlled the Black Sea, nuclear deterrence that kept any direct Western intervention off the table. Against that, Ukraine fielded a military that serious analysts viewed as a regional force at best, equipped with aging Soviet hardware. Outmanned, outgunned, outranged in almost every category. The prevailing assessment among Western intelligence services was grimly specific. Ukraine might hold out for days, perhaps weeks. But the outcome was not seriously in doubt. That assessment was wrong, not slightly wrong, categorically, historically wrong, and the process by which it was proven wrong changed the strategic reality of the entire European theater. The first signs came early, and they were easy to dismiss. In the early months of the war, there were whispers. Reports of suspicious explosions in Russian border regions, fires at oil depots in Belgorod, rail sabotage that disrupted the flow of Russian ammunition toward the front. Some of these incidents were unconfirmed. Some appeared to have been staged by the Kremlin itself to harden domestic support for the war. Easy to explain away, easy to categorize as noise. But they weren't noise. They were the earliest proof of a principle that would define the next 4 years. Russia had built its entire military doctrine around the assumption that it could project violence outward without receiving it inward. The border, in Russian strategic thinking, was not just a geographic line. It was a one-way membrane. Russia could push through it. Nothing could push back. That membrane had already started to fail before the world was paying close enough attention. And then came December 2022, and the membrane was gone. The strikes on Engels and Dyagilevo were not random. They were chosen with precision. Tu-95 strategic bombers operated from those bases, the same aircraft that had been launching cruise missiles into Ukrainian power stations, hospitals, and civilian apartment blocks. Ukraine did not strike those bases out of desperation. It struck them as a deliberate choice, a message. If you use your strategic assets to kill our civilians, we will use our reach to destroy your strategic assets. The return address on the missile is the location you attacked us from. Moscow had no answer for this logic. Not because it lacked air defenses, it didn't. Not because the distances were impossible, they weren't. But because Russia had simply never built the operational architecture to defend deep interior facilities against a threat it had decided would never exist. Complacency as a strategic vulnerability, built over decades, exposed in one night. Then came the drones, and everything changed. Russia had begun using Iranian-supplied Shahed drones against Ukraine in large numbers, cheap, quiet, radar-resistant, deployable in mass swarms that overwhelmed traditional point defenses. It was a new weapon system deployed at industrial scale. Ukraine was forced to learn in real time how to live under drone warfare, how to detect it, how to intercept it, how to survive it. But Ukraine did not just survive it, it studied it. and it built the same weapon system except better, cheaper, and in larger quantities. The domestic Ukrainian drone industry that emerged from this period is one of the most remarkable industrial mobilizations in modern military history. In 2023, Ukraine was producing approximately 20,000 drones per month. By 2025, that figure had risen to 200,000 per month, a tenfold increase in 2 years, achieved under active wartime conditions against a country conducting continuous airstrikes on Ukrainian territory. The doctrine evolved alongside the production capacity. Early drone strikes targeted military infrastructure, air bases, munitions depots, forward supply positions. Then came a strategic refinement that changed the character of the war entirely. Ukraine's commanders recognized that oil was not just a resource. It was the circulatory system of Russia's war machine. It fueled the tanks and the bombers directly. More critically, it funded the entire war, the soldier salaries, the weapons production contracts, the economic stability that allowed the Kremlin to sustain a conflict that its own economists had not expected to still be running in 2025. Destroy the oil infrastructure, and you weren't just hitting a target, you were bleeding the source. In 2024 alone, there were at least 84 confirmed Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, storage facilities, each one calculated not just for immediate damage, but for maximum downstream impact on the Russian war economy. By the end of that year, the strikes had cost Russia an estimated $12 billion in lost production capacity. Capacity that cannot simply be rebuilt between raids because the raids kept coming. May 3rd, 2023 had already provided a preview of how far Ukraine's reach would extend. 2 separate events on the same day. The first, drone strikes on a Russian airfield in the Bryansk region, multiple targets hit. The second, drone strikes on the Kremlin itself, the home of Russia's government, the symbolic center of the Russian state, almost 300 miles from Ukraine's border. 8 drones entered Moscow's airspace later that same month. They didn't cause major physical damage. That was not the point. The point was that they arrived at all. That the capital of a nuclear-armed state with one of the largest defense establishments on Earth could not prevent Ukraine, a country it had invaded with contemptuous confidence, from putting weapons over the Kremlin. The psychological reversal was total. Russia had invaded Ukraine, believing the war would be over in weeks. The war was not over. And now Russia's wealthiest citizens, its political elite, its president himself, were waking up to the sound of Ukrainian drones over Moscow. None of this was supposed to happen. Every Russian military planner who had assured the Kremlin that the operation would be swift, clean, and cost-free was now explaining why Ukrainian weapons were flying over the capital. 2024 brought Kursk. And Kursk changed everything. On August 6th, 2024, Ukrainian forces crossed the border into the Kursk region of Russia. Not a raid, not a demonstration, a military incursion, seizing territory inside Russia itself. At its peak, Ukrainian forces held positions in over 80 Russian settlements, the first enemy occupation of Russian territory since the Second World War. The strategic logic was cold and precise. Russian forces had begun to concentrate along certain sections of the Ukrainian front, building numerical advantages that were starting to tell. By opening a front inside Russia itself, Kyiv forced Moscow into an impossible choice: reinforce Kursk and weaken the front, or hold the front and allow a foreign army to remain on Russian soil. Moscow chose to reinforce Kursk. Ukraine got the breathing room it needed. The Kremlin tried to reframe the retreat when Ukraine eventually withdrew in March 2025, having held the region for 7 months, as a Russian victory. It was not a Russian victory. It was the first time in modern history that an enemy force had crossed Russia's borders, held Russian territory, and withdrawn on its own timeline after achieving its objective. The mines and improvised explosives left behind by Ukrainian forces as they withdrew were still being discovered months later. Russia had told its soldiers they were heroes liberating Ukraine. Now those same soldiers were watching foreign forces occupy Russian villages. The dissonance was not manageable through state media alone. It was visible in the faces of a population that had been promised something else entirely. Then came June 1st, 2025, Operation Spiderweb. The operation had been in planning for more than a year. Dozens of drones concealed inside trucks. The trucks dispatched across Russia to positions adjacent to major air bases. On June 1st, the trucks opened. The swarms were released. In a single day, Ukraine destroyed or severely damaged approximately a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet, the aircraft that had been conducting nuclear-capable operations and cruise missile strikes on Ukrainian territory. Billions of dollars of Russian military hardware, gone. Not through a conventional military engagement, not through an air campaign, through trucks, through patience, through a plan that Russia's intelligence services had not detected or disrupted. The message was the same message that Engels had delivered in December 2022, but amplified to a scale the Kremlin could no longer explain away. Know where your aircraft are based is beyond our reach. Know where your ships sail is beyond our range. Know where your infrastructure sits is beyond our weapons. Russia relocated the Black Sea Fleet. After years of devastating Ukrainian strikes that had already sunk the flagship cruiser Moskva, multiple landing ships, missile vessels, and submarines, Russian commanders made the decision to withdraw most of the fleet from its forward positions near Crimea. The fleet that had once blockaded Ukrainian grain exports, triggering a global food price crisis, had been pushed back from its strategic position by a country it had invaded. The maritime lanes opened, Ukrainian grain began moving again, the weapon Russia had wielded to starve developing economies had been stripped from its hands by the same navy those economies had been told couldn't fight. 2025 and 2026 accelerated everything. Drone production in Ukraine rose from 800,000 inches 2023 to 4 million in 2025. Projections for 2026 range from 5 to 10 million. The industrial infrastructure that Russia spent 3 years trying to bomb into silence had instead been driven underground, dispersed, hardened, and expanded. Ukraine now produces more drones per month than Russia can reliably intercept per day. New weapons entered service. The Flamingo, Ukraine's domestically developed long-range missile, began striking targets that pushed the envelope of what Ukrainian weapons could reach. The Kapustin Yar test range. The Votkinsk plant, one of the core nodes in Russia's strategic weapons production complex. In February 2026, a strike hit Russia's missile fuel production facility in the Tver region. In March, a microchip and missile component factory was targeted, attacking not the weapons Russia already had, but the capacity to build the weapons it needed next. On March 8, 2026, Ukraine launched 754 drones in a single night, the largest single drone operation in the history of warfare. Targets across dozens of Russian regions, hundreds of miles from Ukraine's borders, penetrating air defense networks that Russia had described as among the most capable on Earth. Then, in late March 2026, strikes hit Russia's oil export terminals on the Baltic Sea. Not refineries inside Russia, the ports, the infrastructure through which Russian oil reaches global markets. The economic artery through which the Kremlin funds every weapon, every soldier, every day of a war it told its people was already won. Stand back and look at what has been built over 4 years. In February 2022, the consensus was that Ukraine could not conduct strikes inside Russia. That was proven wrong by December 2022. In 2022, the consensus was that Ukraine could not sustain a strategic campaign against Russian economic infrastructure. That was proven wrong by 2024. In 2024, the consensus was that Ukraine could not penetrate Russian air defenses at the scale required to cause strategic damage. That was proven wrong by Operation Spiderweb in 2025. Every ceiling Ukraine was told it could not reach, it reached. Then it moved the next one. The Russian economy is paying the price in ways that reach ordinary citizens, not just military planners. Russia's central bank has raised interest rates to record levels. Inflation is compressing living standards across every income bracket. Healthcare budgets and education spending have been cut to fund a war that consumes resources at a rate Russian planners did not project and cannot now reduce without a settlement Russia's government has refused to reach. Sergei Shoigu, formerly Russia's defense minister and current secretary of Russia's Security Council, said it in March 2026 with the flat precision of a man who cannot pretend otherwise. No region of Russia can feel safe. This from the man who stood next to Putin in the early days of the invasion and assured the world that the special military operation would be conducted quickly and decisively. The man who oversaw the military that was supposed to be untouchable, saying officially, on the record, that no part of his country is beyond the reach of the enemy his country attacked. 3 questions now define the strategic reality. The first is sustainability. Ukraine's ability to maintain and expand its offensive campaign depends on continued weapons production, continued Allied support for long-range munitions, and continued institutional will to absorb Russian strikes while striking back. All 3 indicators are currently pointing in the same direction. Drone production is rising, Allied support through Storm Shadow, Scalp, and other Western systems continues. And Ukraine has demonstrated, consistently, that each year of the war finds it more capable than the year before. The second is threshold. Russia has absorbed strategic strikes on oil infrastructure, air bases, the Black Sea Fleet, and domestic production facilities without escalating to a nuclear response. This does not mean that threshold does not exist. It means that, so far, the strikes have remained below it by design. Ukraine's commanders have been precise about what they target and what they do not. Critical civilian infrastructure and population centers inside Russia have not been hit. The targeting discipline has held. The third is time. Russia's strategy since 2024 has relied on the assumption that time would eventually favor Moscow, that Ukraine would exhaust its manpower, that Western support would fracture, that political will in Kyiv would soften. None of those outcomes have materialized. Ukraine's military production is at its peak. Western support, while complicated by American political developments, has not collapsed. And the population that Russia was told would welcome its forces is now in its 5th year of war and has not stopped fighting. Putin gambled on a country that would break under pressure. He chose the wrong country. He believed his military was untouchable. His most senior security official now says on the record that no part of his territory is safe. He believed Ukraine would fall in days. Ukraine has instead brought the war into Russian regions hundreds and thousands of miles from the border. He believed the economic pressure of Western sanctions would be worse for Ukraine than the military pressure of Russian strikes. Ukraine's economy is growing. Its military production is growing faster. He believed the drone war was Russia's advantage. Ukraine is now producing more drones in a month than Russia can reliably intercept. Every calculation that justified the invasion has been reversed, not by Western intervention, not by NATO forces, by Ukraine, the country that Russia dismissed, invaded, and expected to bury. What is happening across Russia's regions right now, the burning refineries, the drone strikes on Baltic ports, the air bases that cannot be secured, the oil exports disrupted in the dead of night by weapons traveling 1,000 miles from where they were launched, is not the chaos of a war spiraling out of control. It is the systematic application of a strategy that Ukraine built from nothing across 4 years, learning every lesson the hard way, adapting to every Russian escalation, and returning the consequences of this war to the country that chose to start it. Shoigu was right, nowhere in Russia is safe. And the distance between that reality and what Russia promised itself this war would look like is the most complete strategic failure by a major military power in the modern era.